I've made a few fighting game roster ideas for videos on this channel before, and it's a really fun process. For a fighting game nerd such as myself, it's just pure mathematical bliss to take a thing you like and write a love letter to it, by building a roster of all sorts of characters and imagining how they'd play. You have to balance out all sorts of factors like variety, playstyle, relevance, and popularity too. Any fan can make a roster for an idea they have, and the end result can also show your own perception of a franchise or medium. Look, they make the little funny autism lights go up in my brain, okay? I like them. Through the years, I've made such classics as Super Smash Bros., Yakuza Thing, and a dogshit, horrible Sonic and Sega Racing 3 idea we don't talk about. I've also had some ideas that were a little sillier, fighting game concepts that are just absolutely ridiculous, funny, or absurd, but the characters I pick for that concept are still 100% genuinely what I would add in that scenario. Today I will go over 4 of those ideas I have, and what my picks would be in that situation. This is just going to be a lighter, silly video, so I hope we can have some fun here, and of course, if you have any silly ideas or characters you would add, I welcome that in the comments. Also, if you could subscribe, that would be great, and I appreciate it. Also, it took me a while to finish the script and get this video out, but I promise I did write this part of the script on April Fool's Day. I already had a video I uploaded today for April Fool's though, so the timing might not be perfect for you, but it is certainly perfect for me. I'm gonna begin with the first fighting game idea. It's a thing I call Degrees of Ryu. So, in case you're not aware, there's an account on Twitter called 6 Degrees of Ryu. That account is what inspired this roster. The first character in this game is gonna be Chemistry. Now, Ryu might seem like a hobo, but he's actually pretty smart. He studied at the University of Kyoto. It has since come to my attention that I misunderstood the account's name. 6 Degrees of Ryu is a Twitter account dedicated to connecting a whole bunch of characters to Ryu from Street Fighter. The types of characters covered can vary a lot. But the thing that's fun about the account is that Street Fighter has been involved with so many crossovers, it's like a reminder of this character's history. This is the inspiration for my fighting game idea, Degrees of Ryu. It's a roster made up of the memories of great warriors of Ryu's past who he has done battle with. A veritable celebration of Ryu's legacy, told with rematches against fighters. Of course, these fighters aren't just limited to the Street Fighter universe. Anyone Ryu has fought in officially licensed Street Fighter media, regardless of its actual canonicity, will be here. I will set a rule though, this has to be in video games, so apologies, but TMNT isn't gonna be here. That has crossover with Street Fighter 6, but Ryu can only fight the turtles in a comic book. It also has to be characters Ryu has fought or can fight before, so I won't include Project Cross Zone characters as an example, because unless they're villains, Ryu hasn't actually fought them. Although for most of the characters, Ryu will have fought them in another place. Of course, Ryu himself has to be on the roster, so he's our first character, obviously. The idea kind of falls apart without him being here. I would also like mirror matchups to be possible, because let's be real here, Ryu fighting himself is one of the most Ryu things possible. There's a total of 5 other Street Fighter characters in the roster after him: Ken, Sagat, Chun-Li, Akuma, and Sakura. I want to prioritize the actual Street Fighter franchise a little for obvious reasons, so it's the series in this roster with the most characters at 6 warriors. Those characters were mostly chosen for their relevance to Ryu. Ken and Sagat are rivals, with Sagat being defeated by him at the end of the first Street Fighter. Akuma is a villain who has fought Ryu a lot, and actually killed his master Guken, and Sakura is known for being the #1 Ryu fan and sparring with him. There's also Chun-Li, who was chosen because she's Chun-Li. I've also included 3 characters from other fighting game or beat-em-up series that are heavily connected to the Street Fighter franchise. Morrigan from Darkstalkers, Akira from Rival Schools, and Hagar from Final Fight. Morrigan is super famous for crossing over with Street Fighter a lot, being in Gem Fighter, Marvel vs. Capcom, and more, and Akira from the Rival Schools franchise is here because of how she appeared as a guest character in Street Fighter V. I should clarify now that not all these characters are chosen specifically because I think they'd be remembered by Ryu the most. The primary motivator here is fun, not entirely a Ryu character study. The biggest exception, of course, being what I did for the Street Fighter franchise itself. A lot of Final Fight characters have appeared in Street Fighter as playable characters, and the location of Metro City from the first game is now the main hub world of Street Fighter VI's World Tour mode. I chose Hagar in particular because he adds more variety being a heavyweight, and he's the only protagonist to be playable in the first 3 Final Fight games. He's never been playable in Street Fighter, but he does make an appearance in the last 3 Marvel vs. Capcom games. Speaking of Marvel vs. Capcom, the final 2 Capcom-owned characters are Mega Man from Mega Man and Dante from the I'm Too Good to Make That Joke franchise. They can fight Ryu thanks to Marvel too. I just thought it would be neat to have a good variety of Capcom series in here since, they'd probably be making this. Massive honorable mention to Resident Evil. I came so close to adding someone from Capcom's #1 series, but decided against it to make room for some other company's stuff. If I was asked to add one more character to this roster though, I would add someone from that series. No idea which one though. Any of the Resident Evil characters who are punchable in Marvel 3 would be suitable enough. Of course, right after all of Capcom's franchises are added, the next big step is to add some of their rivals. And in the 90s, the most important rival to the Street Fighter series and Capcom's fighting games would probably be SNK's output. There are quite a few Capcom vs SNK games made around the millennium by both Capcom and SNK, so they get some representation here. Specifically, Terry, Nakaruru, and Kyo from Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and the King of Fighters respectively. They're just kind of the basic predictable picks, so no surprises there. Ryu can also fight Terry in Smash. Don't worry, Smash will come into play later. There's also Tekken, don't forget Tekken. That's another massive fighting game franchise that's had its own crossover with Street Fighter. Street Fighter Cross Tekken. And a little rematch that happened in Smash Bros. For good measure. The characters I chose were Kazuya and Nina. They're iconic characters who were in nearly every Tekken game, starting with the first one, and were Ryu's rivals in Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Also, Death by Degrees of Ryu? I'm so clever. Afterwards comes a bit of an obscure one, Marion Sorn. She's from a shoot-'em-up game called Gunbird, which was made by a dev called Psycho, and then she went on to appear as a character in a game called Capcom and Psycho All-Stars. Now, that's actually a mahjong game, not a fighting game, but I didn't say it has to be a literal street fight that Ryu has fought this character in. This counts as a fight. And I promise that's the only time I do this, okay? Capcom and Psycho All-Stars is technically a whole-ass versus Capcom game when you think about it, so I think she deserves to be here. Plus, a shmup character in a fighting game could be very interesting. I'm gonna round this up real quick by finishing the video game characters with 3 characters who have all fought Ryu through the Super Smash Bros. Series. Those are Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Akira Yuki from Virtua Fighter. I hope I don't need to explain why Mario and Sonic are here, and then Akira is here since he's an absolute fighting game legend, and we do already have Tekken and KOF, so we can get all the big fighting games in here. Akira doesn't actually appear as a playable character in Smash, but he is an assist trophy, and starting with Smash Ultimate, you can attack assist trophies, so sure, he works. Akira was also a character in Project Cross Zone, but as discussed before, that doesn't really count for this. Moving forward, the rest of this roster is going to be non-video game characters. I just want you to take a guess. Guess what massive media franchise known for crossing over with Capcom is gonna be? So for Marvel, I have a bit of an unorthodox list. Spider-Man, Cyclops, and Thanos. all characters who have fought Ryu in Marvel vs. Capcom. Spider-Man's pretty obvious, and then Cyclops was literally just here because of how iconic that picture of Ryu shaking hands with Cyclops is. And then Thanos adds some more villains and heavyweights to the roster. Another fighting game Ryu was added as a guest character to is Power Rangers Battle for the Grid, only under the name Crimson Hawk Ranger. Look, I never cared about Power Rangers. I do have to admit that's the coolest thing ever. I've added Tommy Oliver, the Green Ranger, just because I think that's the suggestion for a Power Rangers character I've seen the most for crossovers. Sorry if it's a terrible pick, I don't know. I've also added Duranjo due to her appearance in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, a crossover fighter between Capcom and a bunch of anime series created by Tatsunoko, a classic animation studio with a huge influence on the medium. She's the main bad guy in the shows Yatterman and Time Bokan, and is kinda credited for kickstarting the femme fatale archetype in Japan. She inspired the Team Rocket dynamic in the Pokemon anime, and she's also partly responsible for the fact that Waru Pichi was never a thing in a Mario game in a roundabout sort of way. She's an influential character, that's my point. And finally, that brings us to our two final characters, Barack Obama and Peter Griffin. Obama is a playable character in an actual, real, officially licensed, browser-based Street Fighter fighting game called Street Fighter Online: The Most Generation. Yes, it would make much more sense to add a Cyborg 009 character, or some of the other guest characters who are in that game. But you can't just add Obama as a playable character in a game and not have me reference him later in a roster of great warriors who Ryu has fought in the past. Then, as for Peter Griffin, Fortnite plays a part in it, but it's actually mostly because of a browser-based, officially licensed American Dad versus Family Guy fighting game where Ryu from Street Fighter is a punchable character. You know what? Okay, I'm done with this roster, god damn it. That leaves us with a final roster of 27. Ryu, Ken, Sagat, Chun-Li, Akuma, Sakura, Mike Hagar, Morrigan, Mega Man, Akira that doesn't come from Virtua Fighter, Dante, Terry, Nakaruru, Kyo, Kazuya, Nina, Marion Sorn, Mario, Sonic, Akira that doesn't come from rival schools, Spider-Man, Cyclops, Thanos, Tommy Oliver, Duranjo, Barack Obama, and Peter Griffin. So, let's get into our second roster now, shall we? One of the most memorable New Year's Day experiences was 2024. It's a bit odd to say, you don't typically think of New Year's as a memorable holiday, but this year it was like a second Christmas. You would stay up till midnight and think, damn, Mickey Mouse is free from his corporate overlords now. The entry of the Steamboat Willie short into public domain was such a great moment that's basically gonna be relevant in the public conscience forever, I guess. The moment a big symbol of a huge corporation became free to use for anyone. There are still rules about it, but it's still a pretty big deal. It made public domain as a concept much more seen by the average person, and ever since I've seen concepts tossed around for public domain fighting games. I like that concept, because it's a silly idea, but can still reasonably happen if someone just decides they want to make it, and public domain is a concept that's cool to me. There's a twist for my roster though. It's a little more unreasonable, because my idea is for a public domain roster with roughly the same size as fighting game giant Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I'm specifically having 77 roster slots, so I'll have to dig really deep for characters to put on here, but there's definitely enough characters who are in the public domain to work with. The fighters can come from any medium, just as long as they are publicly available. The thing is though, I'm gonna limit it to characters who are in the public domain in every region, or at least in the United States. I would love to include someone like James Bond, who is in the public domain here in Canada, but that would mean they can't sell it anywhere else if they want to keep him in the game. Also, do keep in mind, every character can only use elements of their character which are in the public domain. So I can't include Loki and have him like transform into Captain America or something. That's a weird example. There are 7 different mediums represented in this roster: mythology/folklore, real life, literature, comics, animation, film, and a secret 7th one I won't say. You'll see what I mean later. Let's start and try to get through this in at least a somewhat reasonable time. I'll try. For mythology, the first fighters I'm going to include are Gilgamesh and Ra, from Sumerian and Egyptian mythologies respectively. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is what Gilgamesh is most known for, is the oldest story ever recorded, and Egyptian mythology is some of the oldest stories most people really know about. There's also Greek and Norse mythologies, which I can basically use to fill out an entire roster, but I'll just give them 3 characters each: Zeus, Artemis, Hercules/Heracles, Odin, Thor, and Loki. Those are all fairly expected picks besides Artemis maybe, but they will still fight pretty differently, enough to give this lineup some variety. Zeus and Thor are technically both thunder gods, but their weapons can still differentiate their playstyles. Also, a 3rd thunder god has entered the roster, Susanoo from Japanese myths. I can see him fighting with a katana and being one of the quicker characters in the roster to help make him stand out. The last 3 gods here are Quetzalcoatl from Aztec mythology, Maui from Polynesian mythology, and Sun Wukong from Chinese mythology, most famous for being a character in the epic Journey to the West. In case you couldn't tell, I'm trying to represent a lot of different cultures here in the roster. Next up is Anansi, a spider-like trickster entity from West African mythology, and Momotaro, a young boy from a Japanese fairy tale, who sailed to Onigashima with some animals to defeat a demon. From Slavic mythology, it's Baba Yaga, a fucked up evil witch who lives in the woods and appears numerous times in different fairy tales from Eastern Europe. The Grim Reaper is our next fighter, and if you think it might be unfair to have the Grim Reaper fight random public domain characters, keep in mind that I've had multiple characters in this roster so far who have supposedly created the world. The concept of the Reaper also has an origin in Thanatos, the god of death in Greek mythology, so you can consider this an honorary 4th Greek mythology character in a way. Of course, Santa Claus has to be here, obviously, and then I'll throw in Jack Frost and Sandman. Unfortunately, the Tooth Fairy isn't here, so the Guardians will not be reunited in the roster. Norse mythology also gets an honorary 4th character with Gryla. She's a witch associated with Christmas in Iceland, and is a pretty popular figure. You know Angerboda's grandmother from God of War Ragnarok? That's Gryla. I'm also going to add a character from Celtic mythology, Cuchulainn. That was a joke. It's Cuchulainn. I just did that to piss off any Irish people watching. I've also added William Tell, who's a Swiss folk hero, and then finally King Arthur, Merlin, and Morgan Le Fay. Ian had to know at least one of those characters would be here. Arthurian mythology is huge in the modern perception of culture, after all. So for this roster, I've tried to not include too many characters who aren't actually people. That means I'm not going to add generic concepts like an elf to the roster. Still though, I'm going to make a single exception because I'm adding a golem, as in the guardian creatures made out of clay from Jewish folklore. Why? Well, it adds more representation from more cultures, and it's super cool, all the reason I need. Then, there's a bit more modern characters from folklore. Paul Bunyan, Bloody Mary, and of course Bigfoot and Mothman, giving us some urban legends representation here, and some American culture reps. It feels weird to have to actively seek out someone from the US for a roster like this, but oh well. So now that mythologies and folklore are all wrapped up, there's another type of character to get to. Real people. This is gonna be a weird one. This is gonna be a weird one to approach, because historical figures in a fighting game is already more absurd of a concept than this game already is, so I'm gonna set a rule. These people have to be figures who are already extremely common in pop culture, to the point that they're already basically thought of as a fictional character anyways. That's what I mean by historical figures. I won't add like Albert Einstein, as cool as him fighting in a nuclear powered mech would be. There's only going to be 7 of these types of characters as well. First one is Lu Bu. He's a famous general from the Three Kingdoms era of China, and you can find him in stuff like Record of Ragnarok or Dynasty Warriors. Speaking of characters from a Warring States period, famous for their appearance in anime and video games, there's Goemon, a Sengoku Japan era thief known for popularizing the idea of a gentleman thief in Japanese culture, indirectly causing Persona 5. And then, a bit of an odd one, Spartacus. He's known for the movies made about his life, but believe it or not, Spartacus was a real person, and Roman gladiators are a cool thing to have in any roster. I would say someone from Rome would balance out the amount of Greek mythology characters, but he is still technically Greek. Actually, I wrote Hercules, not Heracles, so I guess we have someone from Roman mythology. Also, I'm fucking stupid, by the way, because I'm only now putting Robin Hood on the roster. Why am I lumping him here with real people when I didn't for, like, William Tell? Shut up. Some other infamous people here are the pirate Blackbeard and Ned Kelly, who can essentially be described as an Australian cowboy / gang leader. And then I'm going to do something dumb and add Napoleon Bonaparte as the last of these real life characters. He kind of breaks my rules. I don't know why I'm adding him specifically. It's just funny, and it fits better than most historical figures. Like, it's better than George Washington. And now that all the real life characters are done, it's time for the largest category, literature. Books are probably the category most people would be looking forward to the most, so let's just pile right through them. Beowulf is the first character here. Then I've added a trio of Aladdin, Alibaba, and Sinbad from 1001 Nights. Yeah, believe it or not, there's gonna be a lot of characters here who you know from Disney. I had no idea how to transition to the next character here. I was gonna say, like, something really lame, like, you know who's not from Disney? But I looked it up and Don Quixote is technically in the It's a Small World ride. Fun fact. Joke ruined. Sherlock and Moriarty from the Sherlock Holmes stories are next. Technically Disney. And then Carmilla, Dracula, and Von Helsing. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, besides Carmilla. Carmilla is from an Austrian vampire story that's notable for being written and published before Dracula and inspired Dracula. It's also one of the earliest examples of lesbian representation, even if it's an evil vampire. If you've seen Castlevania, you know her. Then continuing the monster theming, except I do not like calling them monsters, Frankenstein's monster, and Eric from The Phantom of the Opera. More Disney afterwards, with Tarzan, Peter Pan, and Captain Hook, and then wow, someone associated with DreamWorks, The Big Bad Wolf, and Puss in Boots. I am aware of the irony in me pointing out what all these characters have been used for in the past in a public domain fighting game, but let's be real, that's probably gonna be some of the allure of this game. The fact that so many of these characters have been in Disney before. I didn't add Mulan though, because, I mean, I can't literally just have every Disney protagonist who can reasonably have a moveset in here. Next up, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde would be a sort of stance fighter, able to switch between good and evil forms, and maybe even having attacks that could make use of both, or the transformation aspect. Similarly, I can see Alice from Alice in Wonderland being able to pull out a bunch of random stuff from the books, like having moves where she grows and shrinks, for example. I've also added the Queen of Hearts alongside her. My next character is a king, my little viewers will announce. Wrong, my next character is a piece of wood. See, that was no, never mind. Captain Ahab from Moby Dick's here, and then Quasimodo, Jean Valjean, and Javert all represent the works of Victor Hugo. We only have 3 more characters from literature now, not counting comics. There's a Zorro, and 2 characters you might not even know are public domain, King Kong and the Wicked Witch of the West. A lot of iconic parts of the Wicked Witch does come from the Wizard of Oz movie, but we can still use lots of witch tropes for her. King Kong is fun though, as long as we just have a big monkey and do not give him a robot arm, we can use him. I do apologize, by the way, I never made that one post about Jake Gatsby with the steel chair come true, but we get what we get. Now on to comic books. There's a ton of comic books that are in the public domain, so this should be fun. First up is Nirvana of the Northern Lights. There's an absolute goldmine of public domain superheroes I could add here, but I decided to stick with her and one other. She's one of the first female superheroes, debuting even before Wonder Woman, and is considered the first Canadian superhero. Also, by comic book, I guess I just meant books with pictures, cause next is Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. Tigger became public domain in 2024, and I simply picked him over the bear cause I feel like he'd be more interesting moveset wise. But do know that I cannot have Tigger bouncing on his tail. I can, however, just have him bounce on 4 legs. There's a similar situation with my next character, Popeye, who became public domain in 2024, and I absolutely cannot have him eat spinach. Oh well, the image of Popeye is enough for me. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the character choice you all expected, Mickey Mouse. But I can't just add Mickey Mouse. Mickey, Minnie, and Pete are my next 3 characters. They're all in Steamboat Willie, and yeah, I can and will use them here. And if Mickey's here, of course, I'll also need to include the original Mickey Mouse. No, not Oswald. I'm sorry, I don't have Oswald on this roster. It's crazy that even in a roster of 77, there are some huge omissions. I'm talking about Felix the Cat, who was an animation star before Mickey Mouse, and is still popular to this day. Some of his early shorts are public domain, so therefore the character is as well. Popeye, Mickey Mouse, and Felix the Cat are a great trio to represent early animation too. And then the final character from a comic book who I included here is Plastic Man. Although he's more famous for appearing in DC Comics, he technically comes from another publisher, and their early books are in the public domain. He's a relatively well-known DC hero, even though he's never been in any live-action movie. B-list, I'd say. There's also the superhero Captain Marvel, who's technically public domain, but he has way more elements of him introduced in later adaptations, so Plastic Man just fits better in my opinion. I mean, considering the name Shazam is owned by DC, both names we could call him would be potentially legally dubious to someone. Plastic Man, he just stretches, and yes, he does that in his first appearance, so he works better. Let's be real though, this is Warner Bros. And Disney, so someone would probably sue me if this was a real game anyways. With that out of the way, we're down to the final 4, including 3 characters from movies. First up is the Tramp. The Tramp is a character portrayed by Charlie Chaplin in a few of his films, and you can't deny having him beat people up in a fighting game would be incredibly fun. Physically impossible to deny. I also have to admit I made a mistake with my next character. See, the original 1960 movie, Little Shop of Horrors, is in the public domain, but not the musical. It's not that the copyright expired or anything, they just didn't bother to copyright it because they didn't think it would be successful. The original 60s movie is pretty boring to be honest, but the musical adaptation is actually my favorite musical of all time. Anyways, I called it Audrey 2 in this roster visual I made, but I didn't find out until recently, it's actually Audrey Jr. The name Audrey 2 comes from the musical, even though let's be real, Audrey Jr. makes much more sense. It would be interesting to have a literal living plant in a fighting game, Piranha Plant style, but what would be most interesting is to have a move where the plant can sing about being a big green fuck. Never mind! Last movie character is Cheng Chaoan from the 1971 movie The Big Boss. Similar to how adding the Tramp was basically just adding Charlie Chaplin, this is kinda just a roundabout way of adding Bruce Lee. The Big Boss is a film he starred in, and it's one of his more iconic early movies. And then, finally, the last character I've decided to add, Doge, as in the meme. Memes on the internet are a huge aspect of public domain I don't really hear people talk about. Cause yeah, they're super important. shareability is like their whole thing. And I knew in my 77 character roster, I needed to have at least one character from memes. I think Doge is the most timeless option. Everybody likes Doge, and I think Doge is a symbol, looked at more fondly than Bojack's and Rage comics. Plus, Doge can have moves where he turns buff or summons Cheems or something. Get some other eras of memes in there. So that means the final roster of 77 is Gilgamesh, Ra, Zeus, Artemis, Hercules, Odin, Thor, Loki, Susanoo, Quetzalcoatl, Maui, Sun Wukong, Anansi, Momotaro, Baba Yaga, Grim Reaper, Santa Claus, Jack Frost, Sandman, Gryla, Cuchulainn, William Tell, King Arthur, Merlin, Morgan Le Fay, Gollum, Paul Bunyan, Bloody Mary, Bigfoot, Mothman, Lu Bu, Goemon, Spartacus, Robin Hood, Blackbeard, Ned Kelly, Napoleon, Beowulf, Aladdin, Alibaba, Sinbad, Don Quixote, Sherlock, Moriarty, Carmilla, Dracula, Von Helsing, Frankenstein's monster, Eric, Tarzan, Peter Pan, Captain Hook, the Big Bad Wolf, Puss in Boots, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Alice, the Queen of Hearts, Pinocchio, Captain Ahab, Quasimodo, Jean Valjean, Javert, Zorro, King Kong, the Wicked Witch of the West, Nelvana, Tigger, Popeye, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Pete, Felix the Cat, Plastic Man, the Tramp, Audrey 2, Cheng Chawan, and Doge. I could definitely go crazy adding stages or items, and I definitely have enough ideas for a couple of DLC packs, but I think I'll save it for now, because I'm probably already spending the majority of this video's runtime on this one specific part. Hope you found out about some characters you didn't know were in the public domain too. If a public domain roster is ever made, you better ask to add Cheng Chawan in it. My next idea brings us back to a more video game themed roster. It's actually the only roster here to not be a multimedia affair. It's a fighting game based on one particular genre of video game, the RPG. RPGs are hard to define, but mostly have a shared list of characteristics. A level up system, character building, and an intricate world to explore. It's a genre I have mixed feelings on, but I really respect the history and stories of, and I'm going to make a fighting game roster for it today with all sorts of characters from different types of RPGs. There will be a bit of a bias towards JRPGs though, simply because I know more about them, and I feel like they emphasize already made characters just a little bit more than Western RPGs. There will be all sorts of Western RPG characters here, of course though. I can also see them being a story mode or even a sort of leveling up system in the game. That could be a lot of fun. I'll emphasize variety, fun, and repping the history of the genre in my roster. It might be a little unrealistic licensing wise because there's a lot of different companies' material to get through and quite a lot of characters, so let's just say this will be the full roster, DLC included. There's 28 characters, which will be quite a lot for something like this anyways. Let's get into it with the first characters to be added. First 4 are from Final Fantasy. It's easily the most popular JRPG in North America, and a ton of famous RPGs like Kingdom Hearts, The Secret of Mana, or Saga are spin-offs from it. Those 3 series ended up being snubbed for the roster, but that's besides the point. So my are Chocobo, Terra, Cloud, and Sephiroth. Cloud and Sephi are the protagonist and antagonist of Final Fantasy VII, which is arguably the most influential Final Fantasy game, and definitely the most popular. They were also the characters added to Super Smash Bros., so they make sense. Terra is a protagonist from Final Fantasy VI, which is generally seen as the best of the classic titles, and can represent a lot of the magic from the series. Then Chocobo is something of a mascot of the series, and has appeared in a few spin-offs of their own. I mean, there obviously needs to be at least one dumb marketable animal in this game. Speaking of which, Square Enix's other RPG, Dragon Quest, is next, and the first character is Slime, the mascot of the series, who could fight with attacks the different slime incarnations have had, as well as some stuff from the spin-offs. Erdrick, the protagonist of Dragon Quest III, is next, and then Torneko from Dragon Quest IV. He was a party member in that game, but he also represents merchants here. Shopkeepers are a common feature of RPGs after all, and he's also had a starring role in some Dragon Quest spin-offs too. You know the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series? Well, Mystery Dungeon started with games headlined by Tornico. It didn't start with Pokemon, just like how Pokken Tournament is a crossover with Tekken. Pokemon fans don't know that for some reason, and it pisses me off. Fucking. Finally, the last Square Enix character is a frog from Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is often considered one of the best RPGs of all time, and it's had a ton of influence considering it's a collab between Squaresoft and Enix before they officially merged. It was also worked on by many of their most famous devs. Why Frog in particular, not Chrono the protagonist? I just think he's a more interesting character whose moveset will have more to work with. Not biased at all, too. There's not really many healers on the roster as well, although I don't really know how self-healing would work in a game like this. So I wanted a character from one of the classic Western PC RPGs that people don't really talk about. Stuff like The Bard's Tale, Wizardry, or Ultima. Not only are they super influential, to a degree that's very understated, it would just be nice to see their characters in a new light and treated more like actual characters. I considered the Avatar from Ultima, but ended up with Werdna from Wizardry. He's more of an actual character, and I just felt like there's more to work with in that regard. He was the Dark Lord character, who was the final boss in the original game, and actually went on to be a protagonist in Wizardry 4. It's not really as forgotten nowadays, but another classic character from an old PC RPG is Adol from the East series. Nihon Falcom have an unsung empire with their games, with Legend of Heroes and Ys being their two most popular out there, and there's even a fighting game between them at one point. It's not some shitty thing like Dissidia, it's an actual fighting game. Adol has been the main playable character in the Ys series ever since its inception, which definitely isn't the norm for an RPG series, but definitely gives him a legacy that earns him a spot here. Here comes the part that would make this a licensing nightmare. The fact we have Nintendo. Yeah, sorry everyone, but seeing as how Nintendo characters are now in this roster, game has to be a Switch exclusive. Those are Nintendo's stupid arbitrary rules. First two characters are from Fire Emblem. Now, it might be a bit of an inflation of Fire Emblem's importance to give them two characters compared to some other series, but I just felt like there's a little too much bias towards turn-based RPGs here, so more Fire Emblem can represent a bit more strategy games. The characters in particular who I chose are gonna be pretty contentious, Roy and Edelgard. Edelgard is the character from Three Houses I see the most people talking about, for better or for worse, and I wanted one of the Nintendo characters to not be playable in Smash, just for some variety. Roy is here pretty much because of Smash, on the other hand. I mean, he's our boy. Some people would probably say Marth needs to be here, and yeah, he was the main protagonist of the first Fire Emblem, but I kinda think his importance is a little overblown, and he's not absolutely necessary for each roster, given the fact that Fire Emblem has a new protagonist each game. I'm not gonna deny he's important, and yeah, he is technically the Fire Emblem protagonist who is playable in the most games, but I just don't think he'd be essential when Fire Emblem has so many other popular characters. And then the next series is Pokemon. I feel like it's not always considered an RPG the same way Final Fantasy is, just because of how simplified it is, but it absolutely is a turn-based RPG too, and the characters I'm adding are Pikachu and Greninja. Pikachu is the mascot of the series, and the Pokemon who always gets into Smash as well, and then Greninja is the most popular Pokemon as per that one poll that happened a while ago, and it would be nice to have that thief/ninja archetype, since that's not really a thing I was able to add through other characters here. Huge honorable mention to Mother Earthbound, by the way. It's a cult classic series that's had a huge influence on indie games, and even Pokemon in a way. It definitely deserves representation, just got out prioritized. Speaking of indie games, I really wanted to include representation for RPG Maker, which has facilitated a ton of indie games, and it's been around way longer than you'd think. Obviously though, it's kinda hard. The fact that the characters are a little generic is by design, so again, out-prioritized. Once Nintendo is done, of course, Sega is next. They have a long history of RPGs as well, especially considering they own Atlas. The biggest series I associate with core Sega, though, is Phantasy Star, so I'm adding Atlas, the protagonist of the first game. Then it's time for Atlas, and of course the biggest series I associate with them is Shin Megami Tensei. My two picks are from spin-offs though, Nemissa from Soul Hackers, and Joker from Persona 5. I think we all know why fucking Joker Persona 5 is here, and I could see him playing similar to his stylish Smash moveset. Nemissa, on the other hand, would act as more of a summoner who could use some magic from the Shin Megami Tensei series and summon some of their demons. I literally just chose her in particular because she's cool, I like her design, and she's pretty popular too. Finally, Ichiban Kasuga from Yakuza Like a Dragon, the turn-based RPG Yakuza game. He and Joker are the only two characters here to come from a contemporary setting as well. I apologize to the dev team of this totally real game, cause now your workload just vastly increased, cause Ichiban obviously has to have some kind of interaction with Dragon Quest characters in some fashion. That does it for Sega characters. I mentioned earlier the reason I gave Fire Emblem 2 characters is to represent strategy RPGs, but fear not, I also have Liana from Langrisser, arguably the second biggest Japanese grid-based strategy RPG franchise. I'll be honest, I know next to nothing about the series, but it seemed to me it has the usual bland anime protagonists, so I wanted to add a side character. I looked up what some of the best units in Langrisser are, and Liana came up enough for me to just add her. I'm probably wrong, she probably sucks as a Langrisser character idea, so Langrisser fans, seethe. And finally, let's get to some characters from more Western RPGs. I didn't lie, I swear, there are some. First is Shadowheart from Baldur's Gate. Everybody loves that game, but I haven't played it personally. And yeah, this was made before that one poll of the most famous video game characters that had Shadowheart on it, and everyone got mad at it on Twitter. Then, sharing the Baldur's Gate series' former developer, is Commander Shepard from Mass Effect. Phantasy Star and Chrono Trigger might have some sci-fi elements, but this is our first purely sci-fi rep. The Biotics abilities could make for an interesting moveset, and even though I try to avoid overly customizable characters on this roster, Shepard is that, but they still have a lot of personality traits that stay the same, and it's nice to have some of those types of characters in the roster. They are a big part of RPGs after all. People might think I'm done with JRPG characters now, but okay. I just did this roster weird. I'm sorry. There's 3 characters I have from Bandai Namco, and those are the last JRPG characters. The RPG series I associate with Namco the most is definitely the Tales of series, just as much as I associate Phantasy Star with Sega or Final Fantasy with Square. The character I added was Lloyd Irving from Tales of Symphonia. I see him as the most popular protagonist from this series, and the battle system in Tales of Symphonia is kinda like a fighting game anyways. The second one from Namco, bit of an odd one, Cosmos from Xenosaga. The Xeno games are a weird case in this, because Xenogear, Xenosaga, and Xenoblade are all different series owned by different companies, and the protagonists of any of them would be equally as great in my opinion. Cosmos I chose in particular just to add a bit more sci-fi characters and to balance out each company a little. Well, Xenogears and Xenoblade are definitely sci-fi too, but they have a bit more traditional fantasy elements. This was a tough pick though. An original version of this roster even had Noah from Xenoblade Chronicles 3 instead of Cosmos. That's how close it was. And then obviously for this game, I'm gonna need some kind of FromSoft representation. A company with a massive history with RPGs, and eventually games like Elden Ring with their massive success catapulted them into the mainstream. My choice isn't from Elden Ring though. I felt like there is a choice I'd prefer from an earlier RPG of theirs. I originally planned for Gearmon from Bloodborne, but holy shit, a Sony character would make this even more of a licensing nightmare. No, I went with Solaire from Dark Souls instead. I figure he'd be able to play with a lot of the movement quirks of the Dark Souls protagonists, and could even use some spells as well. The Chosen Undead / Bearer of the Curse / Ashen One are all characters I didn't really think would make sense in a fighting game, by the way. Their movesets and characters just felt a little bit too customizable and variable for me. And then back to Western RPGs, just a few more characters left. From Diablo, it's Diablo, the main antagonist and title character of this series. He's got a bunch of different designs across the series as well. Lilith, the face of Diablo 4, was definitely a consideration as well. I will fully admit in this roster, there could have been a bit more indie game characters. There's a lot of options, but many of the heavy hitters like Sans with the Genocide route moveset, or someone from Fear and Hunger or Lisa the Painful have tone issues with them. So there's only one pick I had, Valere from A Sea of Stars. A very relatively recent game, and I just think she'd be a kinda nice pick for here. My last two choices are from Bethesda's two biggest RPGs, Vault Boy from Fallout and Dovahkiin from Skyrim. Technically, meaning Microsoft has representation here, but I doubt they'd care as much as Nintendo would with their IPs. Vault Boy could have more moves based on nuclear weaponry or exaggerated guns, or just moves based on the protagonist of the series if you're boring. And then the Dovahkiin definitely breaks that loose rule I had about not liking heavily customizable characters for this roster, but again, it's fun to have some of them, and I honestly don't know how else I could represent Elder Scrolls. That gives us a final roster of 28. Chocobo, Terra, Cloud, Sephiroth, Slime, Erdrick, Tornako, Frog, Weirdna, Adol, Roy, Edelgard, Pikachu, Greninja, Alice, Namissa, Joker, Ichiban, Liana, Shadowheart, Shepard, Lloyd, Cosmos, Solaire, Diablo, Valere, Vault Boy, and Dovahkiin. Once again, there's an absolute treasure trove of characters I haven't even added yet. Turns out, if you make a fighting game roster for a genre specifically known for its characters, there's gonna be a lot of options. I don't know if this would be a traditional fighting game or a platform fighting game or what, but I think the characters would play surprisingly different from one another, and I think it's a fun idea. Pretty unlikely though, since from what I can tell, the idea of an RPG as a single homogeneous genre that includes Final Fantasy, Fire Emblem, Fallout, and Skyrim isn't really as much of a concept in Japan, and most of these characters are from JRPGs after all. Alright, one more roster to get through. So I've seen some ideas for a roster that are a trend I absolutely want to carry on. I mean, I call it a trend, but it's still very, very obscure. Those are country-themed fighting games. As in fighting game ideas themed around one country's pop culture and general culture. Usually for characters who were created in one country. Look at this roster I found for an Italy-themed fighting game as an example, made by an Italian. No Mario or Tony Soprano, but it does feel like a genuine exploration of the country's culture from the source, and it's cool to look at for me. Yeah, Winx Club and Geronimo Stilton are Italian. Huh. Naturally, I had to do a roster for one based on the country I'm from, Canada. I've decided to call it Melee A. Yes, that's the name. I hope to represent as many aspects as possible of Canadian culture in this roster, but do know there will be a few characters actually made somewhere else, but are from Canada. I'll try to make this less of a priority though. So let's get into this Canadian fighting game. Allons-y sur ce jeu de combat canadien. Our first two warriors don't actually come from Canada, but they're too iconic to not include. Wolverine and Deadpool from Marvel Comics. Those two X-Men mention being from Canada a lot, and it's important enough that I elected to include them. Nos deux premiers personnages ne sont pas vraiment canadiens, mais ils sont si iconiques qu'il faut les inclure. Wolverine et Deadpool des bandes dessinées Marvel. Ces deux X-Men mentionnent qu'ils sont canadiens beaucoup et c'est si important que je les inclus. Next two characters are from comic books as well, Nelvana and Scott Pilgrim. I had Nelvana before, you know who she is, and let's be real, she works better in this anyways. She's even lent her name to the name of a Canadian animation studio. As for Scott, he's one of the more modern examples I've seen of Canadian media being extremely popular, and he would be a ton of fun in a fighting game. I kinda see Scott Pilgrim as a multicultural property, considering the movie was a Hollywood affair directed by a Brit, and the other adaptation is an anime, obviously done by a Japanese studio. But hey, Toronto has always been a constant throughout the series. Les deux prochains personnages qui viennent des bandes dessinées sont Nelvana et Scott Pilgrim. J'avais Nelvana dans ma liste de domaines publics et honnêtement, elle fonctionnera mieux sur ce projet. Pour Scott, il est un des exemples les plus malins que j'ai vu du média canadien qui est devenu très populaire, et il peut être génial dans un jeu de combat. Je vois Scott Pilgrim un peu comme un propriétaire multiculturel, parce que le film est Hollywood mais est directé par un Britannique, et l'autre adaptation est un anime fait par un studio japonais, mais Toronto a été toujours un constant pendant la série. After comic books, we move on to TV/movies, and my first choice, Bob and Doug McKenzie. They're a comedy duo on CBC who got their own movie and animated series, and from what I can tell, they're relatively popular in the US as well. Any of the gags from the show or the movie could make for a fun moveset, just maybe we'd have to censor the beer to orange juice or something. Après des bandes dessinées sur la télévision et des films, et mon choix est un duo de... Ok, je pense que sa blague n'est plus drôle, alors je vais arrêter maintenant. Si tu as 1% de mon audience qui vient de France, salut! Obviously, I'm going to include another duo fighter. The characters from Canada's most popular movie, domestically, Bon Cop and Bad Cop from Bon Cop Bad Cop. It's a thriller about an English-speaking Ontario cop and a French-speaking Quebec cop. They both fight like you'd expect cops to do, presumably having one more aggressive than the other. Look, everyone in Quebec watched this movie, and everyone in Ontario watched this movie, and those are the only Canadians who watch Canadian movies, so that's why it was so successful. Next up is Lunette from The Big Comfy Couch, a kids show that's basically the Canadian version of Blue's Clues. It aired on YTV, which is essentially the Canadian version of Nickelodeon too. The final television character is Bubbles from Trailer Park Boys, a long-running sitcom about people living in a trailer park in Nova Scotia. I know next to nothing about this series, but this guy Bubbles gives me like Kramer vibes. When I look at him, I just get a feeling he's the most popular character and would have so many silly B-plots that could fill out a moveset. Big honorable mention to the series Murdoch Mysteries. It's the most popular show on CBC. No idea how to represent it. I guess Degrassi High can be a stage. I'm not adding Drake to this roster. Next up, cartoons. Canada has a ton of animation and a long history with cartoons, so I'll be sure to add a few. And because of Canadian broadcasting laws, which dictate a certain percentage of Canadian content, a lot of kids spent their childhoods watching some locally made shows. I have mixed feelings on that, because on the one hand, it's resulted in a lot of talent being elevated, but on the other hand, I watched The Day My Butt Went Psycho as a kid. The first cartoon character is actually made in the US, Dudley Do-Right from the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. His whole thing is that he's a Mountie, that's why he gets to be here. Getting to some actual Canadian cartoons, I've decided to add Cyril Sneer from the 80s cartoon The Raccoons. I fully believe he's the peak of character design. He's the typical polluting capitalist villain, although he does become more of an anti-hero later on. I didn't exactly have that much villains in the roster, so he could fill that niche a little. Cyril also resulted in the funniest thing that ever happened in Canada, and maybe in the world too, so there's that. We've also got a trio fighter of Ed, Edd and Eddy, which was produced for American Cartoon Network and became one of their biggest series. Yeah, the Canadian and American versions of Cartoon Networks are different things. The show was made by a Canadian though, so that's why I'm counting it. And then the final cartoon character, also technically American, but starting with the second season and the reboot, it was produced by a Canadian company. It's Johnny Test. Look, you might not like him, but you can't deny playing as Johnny Test in a fighting game would be really fun. He could rocket blast all over the place, and they should absolutely give him an attack where he has like a whip for some reason. That would be great. I feel like Johnny Test is the series I associate with Teletoon, the former name of Canadian Cartoon Network. Not because it was marketed that heavily by them, although it was. It just perfectly fits the channel's whole vibe. Actually, though, that's not technically true. American Cartoon Network did air in Canada alongside Teletoon, but also Canadian Cartoon Network was launched by Teletoon, and then Teletoon rebranded as Cartoon Network, and the former Canadian Cartoon Network rebranded to Boomerang, which is also a separate channel in the US. That's not even talking about the French versions. Of course, we can never escape having video game characters in here, and Canada does have a long history with them, especially in the modern day, where AAA companies like BioWare, Eidos, or Ubisoft have offices in Canada. We're gonna just ignore the fact that it's almost entirely for tax reasons, though. There's also lots of indie games too, like Cuphead and I think Pizza Tower. I'll have one character from a AAA game and one from an indie game included here.
Je t'ai déjà donné la définition que je dis folie, hein? La folie, c'est refaire sans arrêt exactement la même connerie qu'on répète sans arrêt, en espérant que ça change.
Yeah, the first character is Voss Montenegro from Far Cry 3. Most Ubisoft games now are primarily developed in Montreal, and I was originally thinking about a character from Assassin's Creed, but a lot of those games are mostly about exploring cities and areas that aren't Canada, and feature protagonists that are famously not Canadian, and it's central to its appeal in a way. That's not really for Far Cry, even though Far Cry doesn't take place in Canada either. I guess I should add someone from Assassin's Creed Rogue, though. Or I could add a character people like. Montenegro is like the face of Far Cry, and has returned a bit in the series. Yeah, I'd let him shoot Johnny Test. For the indie game, my choice is Madeline from Celeste. She's actually from Canada, and Celeste takes place there, so she'd work best than most characters here, honestly. That is why I chose her over Cuphead or someone. And finally, the last character in this roster, and this entire video, I decided to add a character from sports. The Raptor mascot from the Toronto Raptors. Yeah, it would make sense to just have an NHL character, but I just felt like the Raptor is one of the more recognizable mascots that could really work in a fighting game. And finally, I decided what the heck, why not give this game a boss? The true, secret, final character in this video is an original character based on the Sasquatch. Hell yeah. That gives us a final roster of 16. Wolverine, Deadpool, Nelvana, Scott Pilgrim, Bob and Doug McKenzie, Bone Cop and Bad Cop, Lunette, Bubbles, Dudley Do-Right, Cyril Sneer, Ed, Edd and Eddy, Johnny Test, Voss Montenegro, Madeline, Raptor, original Sasquatch character. And if you wouldn't play the fuck out of any of these games, who even are you? So there we go, 4 silly ideas I've had for fighting games. Making silly, weird roster ideas like this is a lot of fun, and if you have a small inkling of a similar type of roster you want to make, I encourage it. It's fun, and doing some research into a concept is surprisingly informative. You don't have to make them about subjects you fully know. For example, I didn't know a lot about those Canadian shows, and it's okay to make a few mistakes in roster ideas, and accept criticism for them like any other writing project. This video is a bit of a long, bloated dumping ground of my ideas I've had over the course of like a year, so thanks a lot if you're still watching. This is the kind of stuff I think about all day. Of course, I'd love to hear about any silly ideas you have. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.